Alright, everybody! Looks like the internet does not hate me today. Thank you for your sympathy in the chat, everybody. But we should be fine today. Today, we're going to talk about Lord McCartney, and no, I don't know how much he's related to the Beatle guy. The embassy to Qing, China, and then we're also going to talk about the Qing setting. That is specifically, let me get my book. That's the black, where is, oh man. The Black Wind chapter is both the kind of the setting of the Qing and the cause of a lot of its problems. But yeah, if you have your book, we're going to be doing the Times of Wonder and the Black Wind today, probably. And for those of you who don't know what book we're using, welcome. This is Modern Asia at Long Beach State. We are doing Imperial Twilight by Stephen Platt. It's a pretty good book. Probably one of the better written books I've read on the subject, too. All right. Man, the hyperlink didn't work today. That's just weird. Okay, let's jump on in. We'll get as far as we can get. I go a little slower on these first ones because I think the setting's pretty important. We will speed up, and I do endeavor to get through the entire book because it's one of the most seminal moments in British and Chinese history. So it's good to understand the setup. All right, so last class we did talk about the first attempted British embassy, which was poor old James Flint, who ended up in a prison cell. I shouldn't laugh at the poor bastard. But he ended up in prison. And then died in exile in England and teaching Ben Franklin how to make tofu. So today we're going to talk about Lord McCartney's mission to the Qing Empire and why they did it and the results. Let's see, laser pointer. There we go. All right, let's jump on in. And as normal, feel free to ask questions in the Twitch chat or the Discord if you're in there. And somebody already said, poor Flint. Yes, I agree, that poor guy. Alright, so we get this embassy. We learn a little bit about the characters, too. And again, if I'm going to give Platt any credit as an author, probably his life's calling is an autobiographical, how would I say it? His people profiles are excellent, because he really outlines who these people are. Yeah, somebody says it's actually one of the saddest stories I've ever read. Yeah, maybe I study too much history, but this is why we should read other people's stories, because it's good to remember I'm neither a Whig or a good Confucian. What I mean is, I don't think the past is especially tragic, or now is especially tragic. Yeah, for sure it's an unfortunate story. It's super sad. But I think this is why it's good to study history, because we then see that, like, oh yeah, this is, like, the human experience is this. Oh. Like, I don't think nowadays is easier. Think about all the depressing stories that are going to come out of Corona, or, like, self-inflicted stuff. So, something to keep in mind. But yeah, Flint is super tragic. The guy, I'm not downplaying it. That's a hard life for any kid. Alright, so, Lord McCartney. Now, who is this guy? We learn he's a lord, so he's a nobility, right? So, and for those of you who don't know, that's fine. The person who said saddest, that's okay. He's a lord, and he's an emissary. Now, like, why would you ever pick a lord as an emissary? Again, the classic world, because we're in the United States, we almost never study this, which is sad. But we talked a little bit about it last time. Noblesse oblige, right? The obligation of loyalty, or nobility. Noblesse is noble, and oblige is the obligations. It's this idea, if you're rich and noble, your life's job should be service. And if you think about that, our nobility, aka elites, definitely do not have the service orientation. So most important government posts were filled with people who were highly educated, and they didn't get paid for the job. They just went. So McCartney just does this, because that's what nobles do, right? He serves his country. Now, again, some of his service could be interesting, like it mentions he went to Russia and then seduced a couple women in the court of Empress Catherine. Oops. He's also governor of several provinces, including, if you know, Grenada, which is in the Caribbean, right? And then Madras, which is in India. So he was a colonial governor and an emissary. Now, again, if you think about it, if you've never studied British history or colonial history, it actually makes a lot of sense. You'd want somebody who's independently wealthy from, like, family wealth to run parts of your empire, because how can you bribe him? Right? He's in it for something else. So service or glory or honor or something. So it worked out pretty good for the English, but we'll get into that as we go. And of course, one of our side kind of stories will be kind of colonialism. It's one of the big themes. Okay, and then we talk about the two ships a little bit. We have the Lion and the Hindustan. The Lion is a 400 crewed. How many guns was it? What is it here? Man, my brain's breaking. Yep, here it happens. So between these two, right, we have an East Indiaman and a warship, and so a ship of the line. So these are powerful ships in their own right and transport. So basically it's supported by, this emissary is supported by the British government, obviously with an official emissary, right? And also paid for by the East India Company. So what's the goal? Right, open trade and open relations. Now our author's a little bit skeptical, but we'll get into it. Now this includes many gifts and wonders and a letter from King George III. We even have a little bit of, we have a couple extracts from this letter. Let's find that. And of course, I did not, on this slide, give all of the examples of the wonders. They brought a scientist and planetarium. On the letter here is on 22. The ship's most important cargo of all, however, was a letter from King George III to Qianlong, the Emperor of China, its wondrous example of overblown diplomatic language, in which the British monarch bent over backwards to address Qianlong with the imagined kind of politeness, calling him Supreme Emperor of China, worthy to live tens of thousands of lives and tens of thousands of years. He declared the English come to China for not conquest, which was true, and didn't come for mere profit, which was not. And they claimed that it was for the discovery and betterment of their civilization. And where's this quote here? Above all, our ardent wish has been to become acquainted with those celebrated institutions of your Majesty's populous and extensive empire, which have carried its prosperity to such a height to the administration of all surrounding nations. So it's a diplomatic and trade mission. Now, our author's a little bit cynical, but we'll get to it later, but all missions to the Chinese Empire were diplomatic and trade missions. None of them were just diplomatic. So it's kind of weird to judge the British for that. But anyway, that's our author's problem. Now, interestingly, as we learned with Flint, finding a translator is hard. And the two Stanton, father and son, they're the second in commands, and they're also barons. So, again, lords, right? They don't do this for pay. They do it for prestige. The father and son team, both called George Stanton, and we'll call George the younger one, who eventually becomes one of our main characters. But they searched throughout Europe to try to find a Chinese translator, an interpreter, right? Not that easy. So they went to Paris right after the French Revolution, trying to find some, Catholic missionaries. None. Then they went to Italy and went to Rome, right, because the Catholics were sending Jesuits and missionaries. They couldn't find one in Rome. They got lucky in Naples. They found a school for Chinese expats, the Catholic school. And they managed to get two Chinese translators who spoke Latin and Italian too. Now, I love a book like this. It doesn't tell you how they communicated with the crew and these gentlemen. And what's the answer the book doesn't tell us? Every person spoke Latin. Now, I point that out because one of the many... that's not good. One of the many narratives, if you study modern history, is Latin is a dead language. And only the silly Catholic Church keeps it alive. That's actually untrue. Until 1920s, any educated man or woman spoke and read Latin fluently as a native speaker, not just ecclesiastical Latin. But again, if you pointed that out, you'd have to then point out that Latin has validity, and then we'd have to ask the next question, why don't we learn it? But they found two translators, although one was an ornery guy. And then we get to hear about the journey. This one is nuts. It took them a year to get from London all the way to China. And when we talk about China, we mean Beijing. So they had to land in Canton. They had to find their way up the coast. It's a big journey, and it was not a lucky journey. I'm flipping. If you from 25, we hear about it. They lost a ship. They had a brig, which was a small, fast sailing ship. They lost a brig. Big deal. Oh man, Discord is having problems. Good thing we have Twitch. All right, so they had a brig that they lost. A bunch of people got sick and died. All kinds of people got swept overboard. Read the book. It's intense how much they had trouble here. And you get a couple of their fun stories. Like they found five guys on an abandoned volcanic island whose job was to seal club. Not a joke. I shouldn't laugh so much, but it literally happened. Yeah, so long journey, hard journey. They almost lost the warship crossing South Africa. Just a big storm, and it ripped off the anchor. So this is a rough journey in general, and they got there. Now, the reason this is important to point out, we sometimes forget how big the world is, right? And especially pre-steam. This is all sail, remember? So, taking a year to get from England to China. Just think about that distance conceptually, right? Huge deal. Now, the biggest difference between this journey and our last one, poor old Flinty, they got it, the supercargoes, the Canton traders, got this pre-approved. So it's an approved embassy. So actually, since it is from the king, the Chinese accepted it. So it's not a ghetto embassy like the last one, right? Like where it's even just like a merchant embassy. The merchants don't have any standing, right? So it's not just like an ad hoc. I should have probably said ad hoc. It's even a better word. Right? It's not just like a random guy. Because think about it. It's very, like, just a trader deciding I'm going to go to speak to an emperor. Where does he get that? And we haven't studied Confucian kind of tier systems yet. But in Confucius thought, merchants are on the bottom. So a merchant trying to talk to the emperor is the most insulting thing that could have been done. One reason Flint got treated so badly, by the way. Now, this after they get there with the landfall and reception, this one they weren't being like pelted or anything. They did have to change once they got to Tianjin. They had to switch to junks, and we got a great description of kind of ocean trade too. If you didn't read this part, but we get to learn how the prevalence of Chinese trade in the Near East. And they went to Jakarta. If you don't know, it's Indonesia, and it was a Dutch colony. About half of Jakarta was Chinese. So as they got they got past India and closer to China, they encountered more and more Chinese influence in the oceans too. So the Chinese trade was huge. Lots of foreign-based Chinese traders. And if you've never seen a junk, I'll have a picture for next time. I think our book has a picture too. But Chinese trade was everywhere, and they were able to follow that quite easily. They got to China, they switched to Chinese boats because they're flat-bottomed, which means they can go up rivers. And then the initial reception, this, not great. I think they were forced to wait at their first place they got and be embarrassed. Now, what's their initial entry? Well, they got to Tianjin, and then they were forced to march to Beijing. And then they got to Beijing, and they're like, actually, the emperor's not here. You got to keep going. If you have your book, let me see. I'm looking. Yeah. This class does not require you to fully understand Chinese geography. So if you have your book and you look at the beginning, there's a map of the Qing Empire, and it kind of gives you an idea of the size and distance. And there's actually a whole map. I don't actually have a page number for this. Roman numeral 11, right after the index, it shows you the route they took to Beijing. So they had to go London, Rio de Janeiro, a couple islands. They went to Jakarta, which was called Bativa, and then, they got to Tianjin. And then you get to see, they went to Jeolla. Where's that? Well, they went to Beijing, the emperor wasn't there, and then they had to be taken by wagons, with part of them, to the imperial capital of Jeolla, which is in Manchuria. Now, next chapter we'll find out that this ruling class of China, they're actually Manchurians and not Han. If that doesn't mean anything to you, let me say it this way. If you look at this map where it says British China and British India circa 1800, and you look at this map of China, imagine this China has about the regional diversity of Europe. Somebody asked, what ocean did they sail for a year? Well, they did the whole Atlantic, and then the Indian, and then the Pacific. That for the person who asked. So they had to go to South America, South Africa, Indonesia, then China. Yeah, and the reason you did that is you have to follow the Gulf Stream, right? I mean, the natural ocean currents and the natural ocean winds. So they knew enough about that. That's what they were following. I lost my PowerPoint. Here we go. Yeah. So they got here. They were marched to the other capital. So again, the reason I pointed out that kind of thing about China, if you look at all of modern China or Qing China, and all you see is like it's all the same thing, it'll hurt your as we go forward. It makes China harder to understand. But if you look at China and you realize that it has a lot of regional diversity, a lot of the problems we'll see in the next chapter make a lot more sense. All right. Now, if you didn't read this and get this, I'll give my own kind of editorializing here too. A completely different diplomatic culture than the Europeans expected. Now, why not? Well, the Europeans, from then until now, work under what is called the Peace of Westphalia system, which is an assumption that no matter how big or small a nation is, they are... My brain's breaking. They are equal. At least nominally. Even we know Liechtenstein and Austria aren't the same, but we pretend they are. China and East Asia has a completely different diplomatic culture. What is it? Well, for most of history, it was countries submit to China. And when I say submit, I mean you go give tribute, and then you ask kind of for an endorsement from the Emperor of China. And the book mentions this. It especially mentions Korea did it, Vietnam did it, and other local Muslim nations also did it. Now, why would you do it? The book doesn't really mention that. It mentions something like the diplomatic embassies were for trade, but even more specifically, China paid you, basically, to submit to them because they're so rich. The idea was China's so rich they don't need you. So the way they demonstrate their superiority is when you submit to them, they give you a bunch of Chinese goods, so all these embassies from all these countries end up making profit when they come back, because the Chinese didn't care about profit, they cared about prestige. So it's a totally different culture. So this also has problems when the British goal here is to open up trade. The Chinese weren't expecting that to be an ask, so it goes badly. So first, when they got there was no one to meet them. They waited all day outside, and it was really embarrassing. And then McCartney had to go find the negotiator, which is, it was painful, and it really insulted him personally. Here we go. And then, the British demands, obviously, they wanted more access to trade outside of Canton. That was their biggest ask. And they wanted a full-time ambassador. Now, from a European perspective, the first one's always hard, because the British, strictly speaking, were much more free trade than everybody else. But the ambassador was a very normal European ask, so they thought this was reasonable. For the Chinese, not so much. The Chinese response was, status quo is fine. We like it this way. And if you read chapter 1, the wording is very... What's the way I'm going to say it? It's pretty extreme. Let me find some examples of this. I'm flipping through. I just read it this morning. My brain isn't... Trying to find the answer letter here. Oh yeah, so from 42 we get kind of Qianlong's full answer. So, well first, we'll talk about this and I'll talk about the answer. The embassy actually got almost instantly expelled. And why? McCartney spent a bunch of time fighting about the proper practice of how to bow to the emperor, and it personally insulted the emperor. He's like, why are we fighting about this? I'm obviously a powerful emperor. Can't you just bow to me and then we'll talk? So they almost got instantly expelled, but because Qianlong was such a gentleman, he basically let them stay. But why was status quo the thing that mattered? Well, Qianlong pointed out he'd already given the British embassy an abundance of gifts. They should simply be grateful and go home. As far as the British presents, he said, they're nice, but whatever. Tokens of your own affectionate regard for me, as the greatness and splendor of the Chinese Empire, have spread fame far and wide, and as foreign nations from 1,000 parts of the world crowd hither, over mountains and seas, to pay homage, then to bring us the rarest and most precious offerings. What is it we can want here? Strange and costly objects do not interest me. We possess all things. I see no value in objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures. That's one of the many letters he sent back to them. Now, this then raises... so they basically leave with Nothing. The British. They exchange these gifts, and the Chinese give them a lot of gifts too. And then they basically kick them out as fast as they can. I mean, the book hypothesizes, because we now have the imperial sources, it's something like they were scared of getting disease from the Europeans. The Europeans were sick from the long voyage, and they just didn't want to deal with it. But it's actually, they were just insulted too, and they just wanted to get rid of them. So they unceremoniously kicked the British out pretty fast. Now, why this didn't matter? Well, and even as Mccartney points out, the importance of Canton to all of British trade cannot be underestimated. China was the most important trade partner for the British Empire. It made all of the profit. Let me repeat that. China was the most important trade for the entire British Empire and the East India Company. Now, why does that matter? One of the biggest... I don't know how to say it. One of the biggest narratives, I'm not going to say truth, it's definitely a narrative. One of the biggest narratives of recent history is colonialization was all exploitation and profit. My question to you would be, if it was, why would all the profit of an empire come from not the empire? Right? So, generally speaking, that is an oversimplification of colonialization. Often it never made money. And we'll get into that as we go through Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Generally speaking, colonies lose money. So it can't be that. What is it? We'll figure it out as we go. But hugely important to British trade, China was. What was the big trades? Well, they liked British cotton, mostly. And my cell phone's going off. No, thank you. And, okay, so basically, right, so the British needed the Chinese, and the Chinese knew this. So they're like, status quo, they can't complain about status quo because we know how much they need us, right? And then we get the return of the mission, right? They're basically insulted and feeling bad. Now, an interesting thing that I didn't put on the slide, but I should mention, when Qianlong sent the British back, because they're still using sailboats, the ships, well, the Lion had already left because it was so beat up from the voyage, it was getting repaired in Macau. The Hindostan was still in port in the north, but it couldn't fit the whole embassy, so they actually had to march 2 months across China. Now, what's interesting about this, it gave the embassy time to see a bit of China. And then we get, interestingly enough, we get Mccartney's prediction. This was the ambassador who got, and if you didn't read the chapter, he got very much, let's just say he got very negative on China. Whereas when he started, all the British had a very positive image of China. And they still did after this. Like, they knew it was... They knew it was, like, copyable. They were very prepared to, like, say China is a great empire. But then we get McCartney's prediction. This is 47-48. He says, on his judgment on this matter, darkened the longer he thought about it. Against those in the West who imagined China to be a model for stable and virtuous government, McCartney described instead, quote, a tyranny of a handful of Tatars over more than 300 million Chinese. And those Chinese subjects, he predicted ominously, fed at least in part by his own wish to see the Manchu emperor humbled, would not suffer, quote, the odium of a foreign yoke, quote, unquote, for much longer. A revolution was coming. And he didn't stop there. This is 48. China's day of reckoning was not just inevitable, he believed, but imminent. Quote, I often perceive the ground to be hollow under the vast superstructure, unquote. And, quote, in the trees of the most stately and flourishing appearance I discovered the symptoms of seedy decay, unquote. And he thought the huge populations of ethnic Chinese were now recovering from blows that had stunned them, and they're ready to awake. Oh, and his comparison here gets really well quoted. Where's this? He calls this is on 47 again, second paragraph. He says, quote, the Emperor of China is an old crazy first-rate man of war, which a fortunate succession of able and vigilant officers have contrived to keep afloat for these 150 years past, and to overawe their neighbors merely by her bulk and appearance. If you do not know what a first-rate is, a first-rate man of war is a huge sailing ship. Think of like the government boats in Pirates of the Caribbean. They have like 4 ranks of cannons, like 4, and then like they have like 300 cannons. It's this giant, well-managed warship, but it's old and crumbling. And the funny part, this book mentions, these words were written in resentment and anger by a man who would only travel the country for a few months. McCartney knew little of China's history and the conditions of the Interior Empire, beyond the thread-like path of his own journey, etc., etc. And yet, he would turn out to be more correct than he had any right to be. So this poor academic who wrote this book, who's a China expert, has to point out, essentially, McCartney was right. Now, I point this out in my notes. This is how truth works. Humans have this ability to intuit truth with incomplete data. Of course, having data is nice, but being human, one of our huge abilities as humans is we can make intuitive jumps. Now, there's a couple questions I'm going to answer here, and if you have questions, now is the time to ask. First, somebody said, like you pay tribute for an endorsement and the benefits. Yes, you pay tribute, so China gets basically the diplomatic win, and you get legitimacy and basically profit. Not even a joke. Somebody asked, what does Tatars refer to? So generally, Tatar is a catch-all for nomadic peoples out of Central Asia. So generally post-Huns, post-Mongols, because the Huns still exist, the Mongols still exist, right? So the later kind of nomadic invaders from the steppe. If you don't know what the steppe is, it's a giant plain of grass that goes from Ukraine to Mongolia. So anybody who comes from Central Asia and invades, they're called Tatars. So the Manchurians, being on the far end of that plain, are still considered Tatars in this older conception. But yeah, somebody mentions it's an ethnic group. Exactly. It's an ethnic group, but it's also a catch-all for all nomadic tribes. And somebody says, like the Mongols. Exactly. Nice. Teamwork. I like it. All right. Any other questions? Those were good questions. And that's the first chapter paraphrased. I still recommend reading it, though. All right. Put my notes down. And we shall keep going. And we've got 25 minutes. We'll make it. Nice. Okay, let's get a little bit into the Qing situation. So that is just the start, right? The British perspective. Now, the reason I start with these two chapters is it's a great back and forth for the rest of the book. This author tries to give the British and the Chinese perspective as much as he possibly can, which is a very useful, it helps us see the situation well. And there's all this weird movement recently of saying, oh my god, the book's neutral or unbiased or balanced, nothing can be balanced. Only if you're a pure ideologue are you worried about 100% perfect balance. What I mean is, Stephen doesn't have to be a Chinese national to try to give us both sides of a perspective, right? It's not going to be exact, but is it better than nothing and just a pure British perspective in terms of truth and clarity? Yes. And that's what I'm looking for. I have my own problems with this book, which we'll talk about as we go, but I think it's great that it does give us these very human characters on both sides, which is one reason I picked it. All right, now we get our emperors, the one who is part of this whole story, and you now get to see Wade Giles next to Pinyin. So this, if you've never studied Chinese, is Pinyin. This and this are Wade Giles. Qing is the one you see in your book, which starts with a Q-I-N-G. Qing is how you say Qing. Like, it's not Qing, it's Qing, right? And this, I don't even know how you say a Q in English. Like, it's not a thing I say. The way you kind of pronounce it is Qianlong, not Quanglong, right? It's more like Qianlong. So this is the Wade Giles. I'll have both so you can refer to the book easily, but I keep Wade Giles so those of us who are not speakers of Chinese can pronounce within the ballpark. Now, he was an emperor from 1735 to 1799, and as the book mentions, the longest reigning emperor in the history of China, also reigning over one of the richest periods of Chinese history, and he's the same emperor who dealt with McCartney and James Flint. Same guy. Now, interesting, and one reason I really like Platt as an author, he gives the bear story. Well, what is the bear story? Well, it's actually how Qianlong got picked to be emperor. How? Well, he was hunting with his grandpa, who was the previous emperor, Kangxi, and poor Qianlong got charged by a bear. He was 11 on a horse, and he just stood there and looked at the bear. Didn't run, didn't panic. And his grandfather killed the bear with a bow because they're awesome Manchurians. And then because of how Qianlong responded, his grandfather picked him of like 13 grandsons to be the emperor next. So we get kind of this man's character, right? So 24 in 1735, he became emperor, and he had the longest reign of any emperor in the history of China. And it gives us some of his achievements, right? This is on the first page of the chapter. He preserved over massive frontier wars in Central Asia, sponsored cultural projects of scale unimaginable at a last, quote, this is in parentheses, which it shouldn't be, it's awesome, at a time when there was more book titles in China than the rest of the world combined. He oversaw a compilation of literary encyclopedias that ran more than 36,000 volumes in length and would fill a large room. I mean, what does that point that out, folks? The book that's an index of their literary encyclopedia is 36,000 volumes. So in the 19th century, in the 18th century, in the 18th century when this period was, Chinese in China had more text than the rest of the world combined. If you know nothing else about Qing China, that's one stat you should remember. It gives you just the scale of what we're talking about here. And the fact that this guy had this encyclopedia put together, also quite impressive. He was accomplished and prolific classical poet, a renowned practitioner of calligraphy, which is classical handwriting, with a firm hand in government and a taste for over-the-top displays of power and beneficence. He was guided the empire to its apex of prosperity. So under Qianlong, we have the richest China ever got. In the history of China, to give you a kind of scale, China is so far, even compared to the U.S., I don't think let me get my book of data. Where are you? Here we go. I think even today, I don't think the United States is as rich as China was in this period. Let me find out right now. I have my book of book of world numbers. Boop, 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 boop. Yeah. So, for example, right now, yeah, right. It's so somebody asked, was this all primarily from trade? No, China's the opposite. China traded as little as possible because it was so large and profitable. Almost everything they needed was internally sourced. China, in fact, did not necessarily need an external market. Because remember I said it's kind of like, think about, if you've never studied China, kind of conceive Imperial China as the continent of Europe, as one empire. Therefore, inside of that one continent, they can basically produce everything they need and be self-sustaining. Now, of course, it's not that easy. It's more complicated than that. But let me give you an example. Right now, the world economy, and this is 2016, the world economy was $75 trillion. Okay? The United States economy in the same year was $16 trillion. That's around that's less than 20%. In this period, in the Qing Empire, China was 1/3 of the world economy. Somebody asked, so then you're talking about natural resources produced in China. Yeah, clothes, rice, food, luxury goods, everything. China was self-sufficient, and we'll find out soon the reason that Qianlong started foreign trade. All right. Oh, and they expanded a bunch too. I should have mentioned that. He expanded the work of the Qing rulers to expand the borders, and he basically went bigger than the Ming dynasty, which was the previous one. And they expanded into Central Asia, beyond the original heartland of the fallen Ming, assimilating new territories to the southwest and the island of Taiwan to the east. But not until Qianlong's reign in the 18th century that the empire reached its fullest flower, largely settling the boundaries of the Chinese empire that exists today. So the current China's border is basically the border set by this guy. Okay. Now, this is interesting too because we just heard the British perspective. Qianlong actually had a huge appreciation for Western inventions in literature, and he understood the need for trade. Now, let me explain this. He loved British clocks. He never told the British this, right? He not going to give away his position. He had a palace that was completely like classical European styles. He loved European culture. He's the one who wanted to have the Jesuits and the inventors. If you didn't read the book, there was several dozen Europeans who lived the rest of their lives in Beijing, and they just hung out. He's the reason they were there. He wanted to learn the secrets of Europe from them, and he really was interested in European culture. The same person asked, what was the population of China's time? As the book says, it's 300 million plus. And then China has pretty much been a huge percentage of the world population for the last 2,000 years. Yes. They've never not been a huge population. So that's why the weird, like, Malthusian, everybody's going to die in China predictions is a little weird if you study history. The biggest reason China has problems right now is, it's not in the book, their industrial policy means they've poisoned about 1/5 of their current farmland. And to clean it, I think, well, last I heard, it was like 10 years of their GDP to clean it. Or they have to wait 300 years. So China's problem right now isn't they can't feed themselves, it's they've sold a bunch of their farmland to developers, they haven't modernized enough, and then they poison what they have left. So China isn't that China can't feed itself, it's they've had bad farming policies since Mao. Yeah. Now, need to trade. Why do I have this? We'll talk about it. But if you read the chapter, you find out that the grandfather, one of his ways he took over China, and he cemented the Kangxi. One reason Kangxi was able to conquer China and keep it is, let's see if I have it on here. I think I do. He promised to never raise taxes. Ever. In all the history, he said, I will never do it. So Qianlong actually also needed Western trade because the profit of the trade in Canton that the British desperately needed went to fund the imperial government. So he actually also needed trade, which is something he didn't want to actually tell the British, obviously. All right, now there's trouble in the Qing, obviously. Now, what are some of these troubles? First, population growth. The population in the Qing freaking exploded. Let's find this. Oh, here we go, and the numbers are in the book. This is on page 5253. Let me find the quote here. So the population, which also, like their economy, was 1/3 of the world, which actually makes sense, right? It's like, was China super rich? Yes, but it also had a lot of people, right? So you could say it was proportionate to its numbers. So it was about 1/3 of the world's population and 1/3 of the world's economy. Now, what's the trouble? Between 1740 and 1790, Qianlong did a good job. The population doubled to 300 to 400 million from 200 million. So this huge population growth, you got to do something with them, right? That's a problem. And like we talked about before, the state's inability to increase revenue hit them hard. Why? They basically, the 80% of the revenues were from a flat tax on land. So 80% of the government's income came from land taxes, which were assessed on a farmer and landlords independently of how many people actually lived on the parcel. So now we've doubled the number of people. So think about that. That's doubled the need of schooling or education or policing, but the land didn't double, right? So the basis for taxes, which you're not allowed to raise because of the promise of the grandfather, you can't raise, and we've doubled the number of people working the land. So it's more productive land that we can't tax more. And we need more people, like we need more services for those people which you can't get money for. Somebody asked the follow-up question. So basically, China has so many people, it didn't need to trade with others because they had enough people in their own country to buy goods. That was the theory, yes, exactly. But as this shows, right, the problem with the theory is that they, in fact, grew the country so much that the government couldn't fund itself anymore because it made promises that it couldn't keep. And it's just like our problem. Like the United States right now has a problem where we've promised too much and can't pay for it. They also made a bunch of promises. It's hard to change past promises. That's the history of politics. So the grandfather, if you want to know his name, it's Kangxi. And again, Pinyin, Wade Giles. So Kangxi. He's the grandfather who made Qianlong the emperor, so he owes him loyalty. He promised to never raise taxes for the whole dynasty. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a great promise. The problem is, does it work? It didn't work here. No. So this, we already have a problem. Now we have another problem. We have an unhappy elite problem. Why? Well, if you don't know anything, you guys don't have to know anything. I'll explain it as we go. But as we go, we'll learn more about Confucianism. The way the government ministers were picked was merit-based. You took exams on the Chinese classics, and the best test takers were made government ministers. That's great, right? That's fair, that's just, it's so good. The book even mentions it. The British in the 19th century took it for their own civil examination systems. The British whole cloth took the Chinese exams and made it the British government exams. Now, this led to unhappy elites. Why? The population doubled, the slots for working for the government stayed the same. So now, a bunch of people who 2 generations ago, most of your family members who were smart could get a job in the government, now they can't. So now the elites are pissed off because they'll study their whole lives and fail this test. And as the book mentions, it could take 10 to 20 years. So this is on page 54, 55. So the Chinese system, which is based on merit, which is good. Now, do I have it on here? Hold on. Okay, let me explain how it worked in good times before I figured out to explain how it broke. So basically, there was a merit-based system where the best got to serve, which in the good times worked really well. This was widely copied in the West, and the idea came from China. Civil service exams were based on skill. Basically, the best would rule, and then the ones that aren't the best don't get a rule, and there was no controlling for birth. Now, don't get me wrong, if you grew up, they knew, and the Confucians knew, if you grew up in an illiterate family and your parents were all administrators, your chance of being in the administration is pretty high. But if you were a super smart farmer, you could take the test and be in the government. So in good times, it means the best of your society are leading the government, and then everybody else is at least literate and educated, whatever they end up doing. And it's merit-based. Now, the book and many scholars love to attack merit-based testing because it's not equal. Now, I'm going to point out, you cannot have merit and equality. You have to pick one. Now, I'll also point out, if you're a non-ideologue, equality is unachievable. And it's very utopian. Why? Equality means sameness. There is no equality, folks. Before we get to structural equality or like material equality, we don't have natural equality, right? None of us are the same. None of us are the same height. None of us have the same skills. None of us are equal or less amount of sporting, right? We don't have the same attractiveness or unattractiveness. So in humanity, there isn't equality. So trying to get it is difficult. So the biggest critique against the Confucian system from the West has always been equality. Fundamentally, it's a Marxist critique, right? Like a poor farmer does not have the same chance as an elite to work in the government. And the Confucians would say, yes. That would be their answer, of course. But if they're the smartest, they have a chance to get the job. And that's what mattered. And that's how a merit system works, right? Now, the British adapt this idea, as I said. But what's the trouble with the system? Well, once the number of slots stayed the same and the population doubled, even a successful test taker in this period, during Qianlong's reign, by the end of his reign, if you took the test and passed, it still took you 10 to 20 years to get a job. Think about that. So you study for 20, 25 years, 30 years of your life, and then you have to wait 10 to 20 years to get your position. And that's if you succeeded. Rough. So what did this lead to? This led to a lot of corruption. Both people in the system, so basically, there's open way for bribery. So people with means would start to bribe their kids, so basically the kids have to succeed at the test. Then you'd have to bribe to try to get them a job once they passed. And this is also required to pay debts to superiors. There's a whole corruption system here too of, like, to get any position you had to bribe your way in, which caused you to be in debt to your superiors. So then once you got a position, you're now super in debt. So in order to pay your debt back, you would then have to be corrupt in your job to make money off your job so you could pay your debts so you could keep your job, right? Like, this started a hugely horrible cycle. And this basically went to, the author calls pyramid graft, which, quote, led to widespread petty oppression and outright cruelty of officials. And then this then led the people to be desperate enough to revolt. Uh-oh. So now we have widespread rebellions. And then we get the story of rebellions in this chapter. The name of the chapter comes from something called the Black Wind poem. I'm going to read it. It's on 55. A black wind will blow for a day and a night. It will destroy men beyond number. White bones will be piled onto mountains, and blood will flow to become an ocean. And where'd they get this? It's actually from a rumor of a new master rising who's like a scion of the last dynasty. So now we get this bad omen. Now again, many of you here might be, we'll call you, big-brained moderns, and you're like, omens don't matter. But just like McCartney's prediction, this omen turns out to be right. We get widespread rebellions for the next 100 years of Chinese history. All right, any questions so far? Were all social classes part of the rebellions? Yes. Again, this is one reason Marxist history is always incomplete, because if you're a Marxist, everything's oppression and classes versus each other. In this one, the elites were part of most of the rebellions, and the cause of most of the rebellions, and they were part of the suppression. Does that make sense? Like, so there's rebellious and non-rebellious normal people, rebellious and non-rebellious elites. So it's much more about some people were meritorious, like some still had values and virtues, and some didn't, and some were exploited and some weren't. Right? It's not uniform. Not everywhere was equally corrupt, but it got pretty bad. All right. Any other questions? Okay, let's keep going. We're only got 5 minutes. Okay, we already talked about the pyramid of low-level graft, but this was the number one cause of rebellions. Long-standing Chinese history that you have a right to rebel against corrupt government ministers and kill them. So there's the corruption of the official system, which was an unintended consequence of being so rich and peaceful and profitable, led to a bunch of rebellions, which led to rivers of blood. Now we have something called the White Lotus Rebellion. So there's a true master, quote-unquote, of a light Lotus uprising, and then millenarian thought. This is like the apocalypse is coming. There's millennium Christians too. It's a Western idea as well, right? It's this idea that there's this kind of, how would you say it? That the end of the universe is coming, the revealing is coming, the judgment is coming, and so it's a religious and a political rebellion. And then look at the story of a guy called Zhang. There's a lot of good, again, like we talked about with this author, a lot of good stories here. We get the area that this guy reigned. This is on 57. And it was in a mountainous province, and they mention it's always central control in the province that this rebellion happened. Always tenuous, easy to hide. There was many bandits. And one of the last places where kind of land reform showed up. And there was just too much kind of for him to support. And the government tried to crack down, failed. And the government tried to suppress it. They got super brutal, made the rebellion worse. And then this was there was like 100,000, thousands of followers, like 10,000 people flocked to this guy. Yeah, it's almost messianic. Yeah, the guy raised a banner and he's like, I'm a true master. I'm going to restore the previous empire. Come to me. And it started this huge rebellion. And then trying to solve this rebellion led to more unrest, because the corrupt governors are the ones that are trying to suppress it, right? So it causes even more unrest because they're super brutal. So that's not good, right? So it just keeps devolving. Qianlong does a fake abdication. This is interesting. It's a fake abdication because he's so loyal to the memory of his grandfather. He abdicates so he doesn't rule longer than his grandfather. It's cute, but it hurts his authority. And then we get Hessian's story and the war leadership. Hessian was the guy who also dealt with McCartney. We find out after the fact that he was quite corrupt. So he actually had interest in hurting the British-Chinese relations. So he did his best to... how can I say it? He did his best to hurt the British negotiations with the Emperor as well. He was the one who dealt with McCartney, and to mention this, he is terrifically corrupt. He stole cash instead of doing flood prevention, which caused a flood. He had a complete lack of courage. When he got paid to rise soldiers, he sent few soldiers to go suppress the uprising because he kept the freaking money. So, like, this guy's horribly corrupt, and I think we're out of time. Man. We'll talk about Hessian more next time. We're actually out of time. All right, folks. I don't want to go over because, I could just talk about this all day. We'll probably finish this chapter next class. Let's see how far we'll get. want to do at least 2 more chapters. So we'll probably do Edge of the World and Sea and Land next time. And a little bit further if I could. Points of entry maybe, but I probably won't get that far. Let's be honest. So, okay, we're out of time. If you have extra questions, please put them in the Discord. I'll answer them, but I don't want to keep people in case you have other classes. Thank you so much for listening. This went pretty good today. I'll see you all on Wednesday. Have a beautiful day. See y'all soon.